every doctor at New York Presbyterian had given up. The most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast, a man who had built a criminal empire with blood and bullets before he turned 30, was lying in a private room guarded by armed men, connected to machines that beeped out the slow countdown to his death. 3 weeks after 3 bullets tore through Victor Sterling's body outside his own restaurant in Lower Manhattan, there was no brain activity beyond the most basic stem functions. His organs were beginning to fail, and his older brother had already signed the papers to pull the plug in 72 hours. The underworld was circling like wolves. His enemies were carving up his territory, and not a single person who visited that room came out of love, only fear or calculation. But every night, a 27-year-old cleaning woman named Clara Hayes would push her cart into room 1847 and do something no one else did. She would talk to him, not because she knew he was a billionaire kingpin, not because she wanted anything from him, but because her grandmother had taught her an old prayer and a simple belief that the soul can hear what the body cannot. Clara was barely surviving herself. A struggling single mother working 3 jobs to feed her little girl Lily, carrying scars on her wrist from an abusive ex-husband who had thrown her down a staircase while she was 7 months pregnant, drowning in $37,500 of medical debt, 1 paycheck away from the street. She had every reason to keep her head down and mind her own business. But instead, she told this silent stranger about her daughter's first words, about the moon Lily pointed at every night, about the one-eyed stuffed rabbit they had found at a thrift store. And deep inside that endless gray fog of his coma, the most dangerous man in New York was holding on to her voice like a drowning man gripping a rope, because Clara's stories about Lily were the only points of light keeping his mind from slipping away forever. Then came the night that changed everything, when Clara had no choice but to bring her feverish crying toddler to the hospital and in a moment of pure desperation laid little Lily on the chest of a man the whole world had already declared dead. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the piercing scream, terrified the heavily armed men outside would burst in and tear her away. But the scream never came. Instead, the frantic cries of her sick child dissolved into a long, shuddering sigh. Clara opened her eyes in absolute disbelief. Lily had stopped crying entirely. The fragile toddler was curling into the massive chest of the comatose kingpin, her tiny hands gripping his gown as if he were the safest place on earth. Terrified of breaking the fragile miracle, Clara slowly pulled a plastic chair close to the bed, her trembling eyes darting toward the door. So Clara sat in the dim amber light, keeping watch over the city's most dangerous man and the fragile toddler rusting above his heart. "Please do not let them find us here," she whispered into the quiet room, her voice trembling with exhaustion. "Please just let her sleep." 1 hour passed, and then 2, and Clara kept her voice low while her exhausted eyes stared blindly at the medical equipment. But something in the sterile room was changing. The steady mechanical beeping of the heart monitor began to shift its rhythm. It was no longer the flat, predictable countdown of a dying man, but a slightly faster, uneven beat. Clara looked up at the screen, blinking hard because she thought her sleep-deprived mind was playing tricks on her. The green line rippled differently, and the blood pressure numbers were inching upward digit by digit. Deep within the endless gray fog of his coma, Victor felt something he had not felt in 3 weeks. A light, barely perceptible weight rested on his chest, radiating a true grounding warmth. It was not the vague warmth of a memory or a hallucination, but the physical heat of a living, breathing weight. A tiny heartbeat fluttered against his skin, beating twice as fast as his own, quick and fragile like the wings of a butterfly trapped inside his ribs. Victor sensed this fragile rhythm through every layer of the nothingness that had consumed him. Then came the smell of talcum powder, cheap baby shampoo, and the sweat of a feverish child. It was a scent he had never known because he had never been close to a child long enough to learn what they smelled like, yet the deepest instinct within his broken body recognized it instantly. Then came the grip of a tiny hand clutching his gown with the weak but determined grasp of a sleeping toddler. That tiny grasp pulled Victor toward the light more powerfully than any drug or advanced medical technology ever invented. For the first time in 3 long weeks, Victor did not just exist in the dark, but he desperately wanted to leave it. The familiar, soothing voice of the woman was still there, murmuring stories about a harsh winter and a stuffed rabbit, drawing him closer to the surface. But it was the heat on his chest that forced the ruthless Mafia boss to choose between letting go and fighting his way back to the land of the living. At 4 a.m, the index finger of Victor Sterling's right hand twitched. It was a small, erratic movement that was too slight to notice unless someone was watching closely, but Clara was staring right at his hand. She stopped breathing, her own heart racing in her throat as she waited in the terrifying silence, and then the finger moved again. The entire massive scarred hand slowly lifted from the mattress, shaking violently with the impossible effort it took to defy gravity. Clara was completely paralyzed by shock as that heavy hand settled gently onto Lily's small back, shielding the child with an instinctive protective embrace. Clara scrambled backward, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as Victor Sterling slowly opened his eyes for the first time in 21 days. The monitors surrounding the bed suddenly blared to life, their alarms shrieking through the quiet ward to signal a medical miracle that defied all science. The dead King of New York had returned from the void, and his cold gray eyes locked immediately onto the terrified mother standing before him. The blaring alarms shattered the quiet of the intensive care unit like a pane of glass breaking in a silent church. The steady beep of the heart monitor had turned into a frantic, high-pitched warning that echoed down the empty corridor. Heavy combat boots slammed against the polished linoleum floor as the 2 armed guards posted outside burst through the door with their weapons drawn and ready to fire. They expected to find an assassin standing over the bed of their boss, our rival soldier sent to finish the job started 3 weeks ago. But instead of a hitman, they found a terrified cleaning woman and a medical miracle that defied all logic. Clara Hayes sat frozen in the cheap plastic chair, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she thought it might break through her chest. She could not breathe, and she could not look away from the massive, scarred hand resting protectively over her sleeping daughter. Victor Sterling was awake, and his cold gray eyes were open for the first time in 21 days. He was completely disoriented, lost in the murky transition between death and life, but his primal instincts were already taking over to protect the child. A team of medical professionals flooded into the private room mere seconds after the guards, bringing a chaotic wave of shouting and blind panic. The night nurse slammed her hand against the wall switch, flooding the dim room with harsh, blinding fluorescent light that made Victor flinch. An on-call doctor sprinted past Clara, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief as he stared at the vital signs flashing across the monitors. He shouted urgent orders for a crash cart and an immediate neurological assessment, completely bewildered by the sudden stabilization of organs that had been failing just hours before. The room became a whirlwind of white coats, panicked voices, and the heavy metallic clicks of the guards lowering their guns. In the midst of the chaos, a young nurse noticed the small child lying on the chest of the critical patient and lunged forward to remove her. It was a severe violation of strict hospital protocol, and the nurse reached out without a second thought to grab the unauthorized toddler. But before her fingers could even brush against the soft blanket, Victor reacted with the terrifying speed of a cornered predator. His throat produced a low, gravelly sound, a harsh and broken warning growl from vocal cords that had not been used in 3 weeks. The massive hand of the Mafia boss gripped the fabric of Lily's small coat tighter, anchoring the child firmly to his chest despite his overwhelming physical weakness. Victor turned his icy, unblinking glare onto the approaching nurse, and the sheer lethal intensity in his eyes stopped her dead in her tracks. Even battered, bruised, and freshly pulled from a coma, The aura of absolute violence radiating from Victor Sterling was dark and suffocating. The two armed guards instantly stepped back, their faces pale and their mouths hanging open as they stared at the impossible resurrection of the dead king. They knew exactly what that dark look meant, and they knew the nurse was inches away from losing her hand if she touched the child. Clara knew she had to intervene before the situation spiraled completely out of control, and the sheer terror of the loaded guns finally snapped her out of her frozen state. She pushed herself up from the chair, her knees shaking so badly she could barely stand, and took a hesitant step toward the metal hospital bed. "I am sorry," she murmured, her voice trembling and incredibly small in the crowded, noisy room. "I will take her. Please just let me take her." The moment her voice broke through the noise, the terrifying gaze of Victor snapped directly to her face and locked onto her eyes. He recognized that voice instantly, the gentle, exhausted whisper that had anchored him in the dark and pulled him back from the endless gray fog. He stared at Clara with a heavy, piercing intensity, taking in her faded janitor uniform, her tired eyes, and the sheer panic radiating from her small frame. This was the invisible woman who had sat beside him in the darkness, the stranger who had given him a reason to fight his way back to the light. Clara reached out with trembling hands and gently slid her arms under her sleeping daughter, carefully lifting the feverish child away from his chest. Victor did not resist her, but his massive hand lingered in the air for a second before falling heavily back onto the white hospital mattress. His chest heaved with the immense effort of simply staying awake, but his cold gray eyes never left the face of Clara as she pulled the toddler against her shoulder. The room immediately descended back into medical chaos as the doctors swarmed the bed, shining pen lights into the eyes of Victor and shouting about brain activity. No one was paying attention to the invisible cleaning woman anymore, and Clara realized this was her only chance to escape the disastrous mistake she had just made. Clara backed away slowly, clutching Lily so tightly that the child let out a soft, sleepy whimper against her neck before settling back to sleep. She slipped out the open door, sliding past the massive bodyguards who were far too busy calling their superiors to notice a lowly janitor disappearing into the hallway. The moment she was out of sight, Clara broke into a desperate, frantic run, bypassing the slow elevators and throwing her weight against the heavy metal door of the emergency stairwell. Her worn sneakers slapped loudly against the concrete steps, the sound echoing violently as she descended 6 flights of stairs as fast as her legs could carry her. Her lungs burned with every breath, and her mind spun with the absolute certainty that she was going to be fired, arrested, or possibly killed. She had just placed her sick daughter on the chest of a man guarded by armed mercenaries, and she knew those dangerous men would start asking questions the moment the shock wore off. They would review the security footage, they would ask the night staff, and they would come looking for the woman who had breached the most secure room in the hospital. She hit the ground floor, pushed through the service exit, and burst out into the freezing New York night, desperate to put as much distance between herself and the hospital as possible. The brutal winter wind sliced through her thin jacket instantly, biting at her skin and making her eyes water as she plunged into the darkness. She wrapped her oversized coat completely around Lily, shielding the sleeping toddler from the falling snow and the bitter, unforgiving ice of the city streets. Clara ran down the darkened alleyway behind the hospital, her breath forming panicked white clouds in the frigid air, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She did not look back at the towering hospital building, and she did not slow down her frantic pace until she reached the safety of the underground subway station. She huddled on the cold wooden bench waiting for the train, shivering uncontrollably while holding her daughter close to her chest and praying for invisibility. She thought she had narrowly escaped the worst mistake of her entire life, completely unaware that her voice and her face were already burned into the mind of a ruthless kingpin. The East Coast underworld was about to explode into unprecedented violence as the dead king reclaimed his throne, and Clara had no idea that the most dangerous man in the city was already looking for her. 48 hours after opening his eyes, Victor Sterling walked out of New York Presbyterian Hospital. He did not use a wheelchair, and he did not accept the physical therapy the terrified doctors recommended. His body was a bruised canvas of bullet wounds and atrophied muscles, but his sheer willpower forced his legs to move. He stepped into the freezing winter air, wearing a tailored black overcoat that hid the bandages wrapped tightly around his chest. 3 black SUVs waited at the curb with their engines idling in the snow. His top enforcer, Silas, stood by the open door of the lead vehicle with a look of absolute awe mixed with cold relief. The underworld had spent 3 weeks carving up his territory like scavengers picking out a corpse. Victor slid into the leather seat of the SUV and stared out at the passing city lights. He knew exactly what had to be done before the sun rose again, and he was ready to remind the city who truly owned the streets. The emergency summit took place in the soundproof basement of a meatpacking warehouse in the meatpacking district. 5 of his top lieutenants sat around a steel table, their faces pale and slick with nervous sweat. These were the men who had stopped answering the calls of Silas during the 2nd week of his coma. They had quietly shifted their loyalty to rival families, assuming the dead king would never rise to punish them. Victor walked into the room without a single word, the heavy metal door locking shut behind him with a final, echoing thud. He did not shout, and he did not throw a tantrum like a lesser boss. He simply pulled a silence pistol from his coat and shot the man sitting at the head of the table straight through the chest. The body hit the concrete floor, and the remaining 4 men froze in absolute terror, too afraid to even flinch. Victor set the smoking gun on the steel table and looked at the surviving traitors with eyes like shattered ice. He told them they had exactly 1 hour to return every stolen dollar and sever all ties with his enemies, or they would join their friend on the floor. News of the execution spread through the New York underworld faster than a forest fire. The shockwave of his miraculous recovery was instantly eclipsed by the brutal reality of his vengeance. Rivals who had proudly claimed his territories just days ago suddenly abandoned their posts and retreated into the shadows. Business partners who had ignored his legal team suddenly sent massive apologies and doubled their monthly payments out of sheer panic. Victor reclaimed his fractured empire piece by piece, sitting in his penthouse office while his men dismantled the brief rebellion with surgical precision. But even as the money flowed back in and the streets fell silent in fear, the mind of Victor was not on the blood or the power. He sat in his leather chair, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, and rubbed his massive hand over his chest where the bullet wounds still burned. The physical pain meant nothing to him, but the lingering ghost of a tiny, feverish heartbeat resting against his skin drove him to the brink of madness. Victor poured himself a glass of expensive whiskey and drank it slowly, trying to drown out the noise of his own thoughts. He could still smell the faint scent of talcum powder and cheap baby shampoo over the heavy smell of gun smoke. He could still hear the gentle, exhausted whisper of the woman who had sat beside him in the endless gray void. She had talked about a stuffed rabbit missing an eye, and she had talked about the moon, completely unaware that she was speaking to a monster. Victor had spent his entire 35 years building walls of ice and violence, trusting no one and loving nothing. But that invisible cleaning woman had slipped right through his defenses without even trying, pulling him back to life with nothing but simple kindness. He set his empty glass on the heavy mahogany desk and pressed the intercom button to summon Silas into the room. He could not focus on ruling the city until he found the only 2 people who made him feel like he was actually alive. Silas entered the office silently, his eyes dark and calculating, ready for another kill order. But Victor did not hand him a target package or a list of rival businesses to burn down. Instead, he ordered his deadliest enforcer to track down a lowly hospital janitor and a little girl named Lily. He described the faded uniform, the auburn hair, and the exhausted green eyes that had stared at him in the chaotic hospital room. He told Silas to pull every frame of security footage from New York Presbyterian, to bribe every shift manager, and to hack the payroll records until they had a name. Silas hesitated for a fraction of a second, clearly confused as to why the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast cared about a cleaning woman. But Victor leveled a stare at him that promised absolute destruction if he asked a single question. "Find her," Victor commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that left no room for failure. "Find out where she lives, find out what she owes, and bring me everything." Clara dragged her feet up the 5 flights of concrete stairs to her Bronx apartment. The flickering fluorescent bulb on her floor hummed a sad, broken tune that perfectly matched her exhaustion. Her bones ached from scrubbing hospital floors, and her hands were raw from the harsh chemical bleach of her second job at the laundromat. She was 2 months behind on rent, and the angry red eviction notice taped to her door yesterday still haunted her every step. But tonight, there was something far worse than an eviction notice waiting for her in the dimly lit hallway. Brad leaned against the peeling paint of her doorframe with a smug, calculated smile twisting his lips. The smell of stale beer and cheap cigarettes radiated from his heavy winter coat, bringing back a flood of terrifying memories. He had not seen or asked about Lily in over 2 years, ever since the night he threw Clara down the stairs. "Leave me alone, Brad," she whispered, her voice shaking as she stepped between him and the locked door. He only laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed off the concrete walls as he blocked her path. He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his jacket and shoved them hard against her chest. The heavy papers slipped from her frozen fingers and scattered across the dirty hallway floor. Brad leaned in close, his voice dripping with fake sympathy as he told her he was filing for full custody of their daughter. He claimed a judge would never let a broke, exhausted janitor keep a child when she worked 3 jobs and left the girl with strangers every night. Clara felt the blood drain completely from her face as the narrow corridor began to spin. She knew Brad did not want Lily because he had never wanted a child to begin with. He wanted absolute control, he wanted revenge, and most importantly, he wanted money. "I will drop the lawsuit if you pay me $10,000 by Friday," he said, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. It was a staggering, impossible amount of money for a woman who skipped meals just to buy baby formula. He stepped over the scattered papers and walked away down the dark stairwell, whistling a cheerful tune as he left her completely broken. Clara sank slowly to the cold floor, gathering the legal threats with shaking hands while hot tears blurred her vision. She locked the apartment door behind her and slid down the wood paneling until she hit the floor. Lily was fast asleep on a pile of worn blankets in the corner, clutching her one-eyed stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Clara covered her mouth with both hands to muffle the violent, heavy sobs tearing from her throat. She was already drowning in $37,500 of medical debt from when Lily had pneumonia last winter. The hospital billing department called her twice a day, their robotic voices demanding money she simply did not possess. Now Brad was threatening to take the only beautiful thing she had left in this miserable world. She looked around the cramped, freezing studio apartment and felt the walls closing in on her like a concrete tomb. There was no one she could call for help, no family to lend her money, and no expensive lawyer who would take her case for free. She was a ghost in a city that crushed poor people every single day without a second thought. Clara closed her tired eyes and prayed for a miracle she did not even believe in anymore. She prayed to a universe that had ignored her for 27 years, begging for just one single break. The next morning brought a gray, bitter dawn that offered no answers and no hope. Clara gathered her mail from the broken metal box in the lobby, expecting another stack of final notices and angry red bills. She shuffled through the envelopes on the subway ride to her morning shift, her eyes swollen and burning from a completely sleepless night. One thick white envelope caught her attention because it bore the official seal of the Central Medical Collections Agency. She opened it with trembling fingers, fully preparing herself for a lawsuit or a final demand for her $37,500 debt. But the words printed on the heavy cardstock made her stop breathing entirely. The paper clearly stated that her account balance was $0 and her massive debt had been paid in full. There was a brief note attached to the bottom explaining that an anonymous charitable foundation had covered the entire hospital bill. Clara read the letter 3 times, tracing the dark ink with her thumb to make sure it was not a cruel hallucination. The crushing weight that had suffocated her for months vanished in a single, impossible instant. But as the subway rattled violently over the tracks, a deep and terrifying suspicion began to creep into her heart. No one in her invisible world gave away $37,500 for nothing, and Clara knew that miracles always came with a hidden price. Brad Morrison did not like being ignored, and he liked losing money even less. He had spent the entire weekend drinking cheap beer and calculating exactly how to spend the $10,000 he planned to extort from his ex-wife. But his greedy fantasy shattered when a contact at the collection agency casually mentioned that the massive medical debt of Clara Hayes had been completely wiped clean. Brad realized Clara had access to serious money, and his simple extortion plan quickly evolved into absolute rage. He gathered 4 violent thugs from a local bar, promising them a cut of the cash if they helped him tear her small apartment apart. The 5 men marched into the dilapidated Bronx building just after midnight, their heavy boots pounding loudly against the broken concrete steps. They carried baseball bats and iron pikes, their breath reeking of cheap alcohol and ugly intentions. Brad cracked his knuckles as they reached the landing of the 4th floor, fully prepared to break the door down and take every single thing Clara had left. He was a coward who only felt strong when he was terrifying a defenseless woman in the dark. But the 5 men never made it to the 5th floor. The flickering fluorescent light on the landing suddenly popped and died, plunging the narrow stairwell into absolute, suffocating darkness. Brad stopped walking, a sudden and unnatural chill crawling up the back of his neck as the heavy silence of the building pressed in on him. Out of the pitch-black shadows, the terrifying metallic click of several handguns being cocked echoed off the peeling walls. A blinding flashlight beam snapped on, hitting Brad right in the eyes and freezing him perfectly in place like a trapped animal. Standing on the steps directly above them were 6 men dressed in immaculate black suits, their faces completely devoid of any human emotion. Silas stood at the front of the pack with a suppressed pistol aimed directly at the center of Brad's forehead. The 4 hired thugs dropped their iron pikes instantly, realizing in one terrifying second that they had walked straight into a nightmare they could not survive. Then the sea of black suits parted in perfect silence, and Victor Sterling stepped slowly down the concrete stairs. The most dangerous man on the East Coast did not look like he had just woken up from a 3-week coma. Victor wore a tailored dark overcoat that absorbed the dim light, and his cold gray eyes locked onto Brad with the lethal intensity of a starving wolf. He did not shout, and he did not raise his voice above a slow, gravelly whisper that chilled the blood of every man in the stairwell. Victor casually adjusted his expensive cuffs and informed Brad that the air he was currently breathing was a temporary gift. He stated very clearly that Clara Hayes and her daughter were no longer invisible, and they were no longer unprotected. Victor stepped close enough for Brad to smell the expensive cologne and the faint, lingering scent of gunpowder clinging to the Mafia boss. If you ever breathe in her direction again, if you even think her name in your miserable sleep, I will erase your entire existence from this earth, Victor promised softly. He did not threaten to beat or torture him, but the absolute certainty in his cold voice promised a level of violence Brad could not even comprehend. Victor stared deeply into the soul of the abusive coward and watched it shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The blood completely drained from the face of Brad, his knees knocking together so violently he nearly collapsed on the concrete landing. He could not speak, and he could not breathe, so he simply nodded his head in absolute, pathetic submission. Silas lowered his weapon just a fraction of an inch, and that tiny movement was all the permission the mercenaries needed to run for their miserable lives. The four thugs scrambled backward down the stairs, shoving each other out of the way in a frantic, desperate stampede toward the front door. Brad stumbled after them, tripping over his own feet and weeping openly as he fled into the freezing New York night. He ran straight to his apartment, packed a single duffel bag with trembling hands, and boarded a bus heading out of the state before the sun even began to rise. Back on the 5th floor of the silent Bronx building, Clara lay awake in her cramped bed, holding Lily tightly against her chest. She listened to the distant howling of the winter wind, completely unaware that the monsters in the shadows had just saved her life. She did not know that a ruthless kingpin was currently standing guard outside her door, ensuring she would never be hurt again. Clara walked out of the heavy glass doors of the laundromat at 4 in the afternoon. The bitter wind immediately whipped her auburn hair across her tired face. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shivering frame and began the long walk toward the subway station. But a massive black luxury sedan was idling right at the corner of the broken sidewalk. A tall man in an immaculate dark suit stepped out of the vehicle and blocked her path. It was Silas. He did not look like a bill collector, and he certainly did not look like a police officer. He possessed the cold, perfectly terrifying stillness of a professional killer. Clara froze in her tracks, her heart slamming frantically against her ribs as she clutched her worn canvas bag. Silas slowly raised his empty hands to show he meant no harm, speaking in a very polite but absolutely immovable tone. He told her that his employer simply wanted to buy her a cup of coffee to say thank you for her kindness at the hospital. Clara knew she was standing on a public street, but she also knew screaming would not save her from a man like this. She took a deep breath, terrified but unwilling to show weakness, and slid into the warm leather interior of the waiting car. The silent ride through the city ended in front of an upscale cafe in the heart of Manhattan. The expensive coffee shop was supposed to be bustling with the late afternoon rush, but it was completely empty. The closed sign hung stubbornly in the window, and two massive men in dark suits stood casually near the entrance. Clara stepped out of the vehicle and felt the heavy weight of their calculated stares tracking her every single move. She pushed through the heavy glass door, and the rich smell of roasted coffee and expensive pastries hit her frozen senses. Sitting alone at a corner table was the man from room 1847. Victor Sterling wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that hid the fresh bandages wrapping his chest. He did not look like the frail, dying patient she had prayed over just a few nights ago. He radiated an overwhelming, suffocating aura of absolute power and ruthless authority. Clara stood frozen near the entrance, her worn sneakers looking entirely out of place on the pristine hardwood floor. Victor looked up from his black coffee, his piercing gray eyes locking onto her face with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. He gestured to the empty chair across from him, and Clara walked forward like a deer stepping willingly toward a waiting lion. Clara sat down on the edge of the velvet chair, keeping her hands tightly folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Victor did not bother with small talk or polite introductions because he did not know how to waste time. He simply looked at her and said he heard everything she told him in the endless dark. He thanked her for the stories about Lily, and he thanked her for keeping him anchored when he was ready to slip away forever. Then he slid a thick cream-colored folder across the polished wooden table. Clara looked down at the documents, her tired eyes scanning the heavy legal print and the staggering numbers written on the page. It was an employment contract for the position of executive director at a brand new charitable foundation. The salary was easily in the six figures, accompanied by full premium health insurance and the deed to a highly secure two-bedroom apartment in a beautiful neighborhood. Victor explained in his low, grovelly voice that he was building a legitimate charity to support single mothers and protect vulnerable children. He wanted her to run the entire operation completely free from the crushing poverty that was slowly destroying her life. It was a golden ticket, a miraculous escape from the grueling nightmare she had endured for the past 3 years. But Clara did not reach for the expensive pen resting on top of the open folder. She looked away from the staggering amount of money and stared deeply into the cold gray eyes of Victor Sterling. She saw the fresh scars on his neck and the lethal, unblinking awareness of the armed men guarding the front door. This was not a kindly rich benefactor handing out blessings to the poor. This was a man bathed in blood, a predator who ruled a dark and violent world where people disappeared for asking the wrong questions. The anonymous donation that had wiped out her $37,500 debt suddenly made terrifying sense. She realized Victor had quietly bought her freedom, and now he was trying to buy her loyalty. Clara knew exactly what happened to women who owed their lives to powerful, controlling men. She had barely survived Brad, and Brad was nothing compared to the absolute monster sitting across from her. If she signed those papers, she would be stepping out of the freezing rain and directly into a burning fire. She would drag her innocent daughter into a world where enemies left threats on pillows and disputes were settled with bullets. Clara slowly closed the thick folder and pushed it firmly back across the table. The soft sliding sound of the heavy paper felt louder than a gunshot in the silent, empty cafe. She looked Victor straight in the eye, ignoring the sudden, dangerous tension radiating from the bodyguards standing in the shadows. She told him no. She thanked him for the generous offer, but she stated very clearly that she did not accept charity from strangers. Clara explained that she had survived 27 years by fighting her own battles and scrubbing floors until her hands bled. She refused to trade her hard-earned independence for a gilded cage, no matter how much money was stacked inside it. She told Victor she did not want to owe a massive debt to a man who lived a life surrounded by guns and bodyguards. She was a mother first, and she would never expose Lily to the dangerous shadows that clearly followed him everywhere he went. Her voice did not shake, and she did not break eye contact as she rejected the wealth that most people would have killed to possess. The entire cafe descended into a heavy, suffocating silence that lasted for what felt like an eternity. Silas shifted his weight by the door, his hand drifting instinctively toward the weapon hidden beneath his jacket. No one in the entire history of the East Coast underworld had ever looked Victor Sterling in the face and told him no. But Victor did not explode into a violent rage, and he did not order his men to teach her a brutal lesson in respect. Instead, a strange and profound stillness washed over his hardened features. He looked at the fierce, unyielding pride shining in her exhausted green eyes, and he felt a deep, genuine respect that he had never experienced in his entire life. He gave her a slow, measured nod, telling her that he completely understood her decision. He softly added that the offer would remain permanently open on his desk if she ever changed her mind. Clara stood up from the velvet chair, turned her back on the most dangerous man in New York, and walked out the glass doors. Victor watched her disappear into the freezing city streets, realizing the invisible cleaning woman was far stronger than any mob boss he had ever faced. Clara was scrubbing the cold tile floors of the hospital lobby when she heard the breaking news broadcast echoing from the waiting room television. She paused her heavy mop and looked up at the glowing screen with exhausted eyes. The news anchor spoke with a grim urgency about a federal indictment and a miraculous medical recovery. Then the face of Victor Sterling suddenly appeared on the screen in bright, undeniable colors. It was not a blurred hospital photo, but a sharp surveillance image of him walking out of a courthouse in a tailored suit. The reporter called him the most ruthless mafia boss on the entire East Coast. They detailed a massive criminal empire built on extortion, illegal gambling, and violent retaliation. They spoke of the 3 bullets that had nearly ended his life outside his own restaurant just weeks ago. The heavy mop slipped entirely from the raw hands of Clara and clattered loudly against the polished floor. She stared at the television without blinking, feeling all the blood drain from her face as the chilling reality finally set in. The silent stranger she had prayed over every single night was an absolute monster. An icy wave of pure terror washed over her from head to toe. Clara gripped the edge of a plastic waiting room chair to keep her trembling knees from collapsing beneath her. She had carried her innocent daughter into the private room of a lethal kingpin. She had laid her precious child directly onto the chest of a man who ordered executions and destroyed lives without a single second thought. She had blindly assumed the armed men in the hallway were just private security for a wealthy businessman. The crushing $37,500 debt he had paid off was not a miracle from heaven. It was blood money wrung from the suffering and fear of other people. Clara felt physically sick to her stomach as a hot, sharp anger quickly replaced her initial shock. She felt deeply betrayed because she had poured out her darkest secrets and her most fragile hopes to a man who lived completely bathed in violence. She knew she had to sever this invisible thread immediately before the darkness of his world swallowed her daughter whole. Clara did not wait for her night shift to end. She grabbed her worn coat from the basement locker room and walked straight out into the freezing New York night. She marched to a corner payphone that smelled like stale smoke and dialed the private number printed on the employment contract Silas had offered her. The phone rang exactly one time before the cold, mechanical voice of Silas answered the call. Clara did not tremble, and she did not let her voice shake as she issued her demand. She demanded to see Victor Sterling immediately, choosing a crowded public park in the middle of the day where his armed men could not easily trap her. Silas remained completely silent for 3 seconds before simply giving her a time and hanging up the heavy receiver. Clara spent the rest of the night pacing the cracked linoleum floor of her Bronx apartment. She watched Lily sleep peacefully with her one-eyed stuffed rabbit, drawing every ounce of courage she possessed from the steady rise and fall of her daughter's chest. She was going to look a monster right in the eye and tell him to disappear. The midday sun offered no real warmth as Clara stood near the frozen fountain in Washington Square Park. Victor arrived exactly on time, parting the crowded walkways like a dark ship cutting through a stormy sea. He wore a heavy black overcoat, and Silas shadowed him silently from a calculated distance. Victor looked at Clara with those piercing gray eyes, completely stripping away the noise of the city until it felt like they were the only two people in the world. But Clara did not back down, and she did not let the intimidating aura of his presence silence her. "I saw the news," she said, her voice rising with a desperate, protective fury. "I know exactly what you are, and I know where your money comes from." She told him that she had been incredibly stupid to trust a stranger in a hospital bed with the safety of her child. She stated firmly that she wanted absolutely nothing to do with his money, his charity, or his violent existence. She refused to let her innocent daughter become collateral damage in a bloody mob war. Victor listened to her fierce accusations without interrupting and without showing a single flash of anger. The chaotic noise of the busy park seemed to fade into a heavy, suffocating silence between them. He finally spoke, his gravelly voice fracturing slightly at the edges of his words. "You are the only person who ever looked at me without wanting something," he said softly. He confessed that her voice in the darkness was the only pure thing he had ever known, and he asked her quietly not to take that light away from him. But Clara hardened her breaking heart, remembering the eviction notices, the bruises from her past, and the absolute necessity of keeping Lily safe. "Forget our names," she commanded, fighting back the hot tears stinging her eyes. "Forget the stories about the moon, and leave us alone forever." She turned her back on the most powerful man in the city without waiting for a reply. Clara walked away through the freezing park, knowing she had just shattered the only invisible thread holding the dead king to his humanity. Dominic Russo did not become the head of the Southern Syndicate by ignoring the quiet whispers of the streets. He was a man built of cold calculation, infinite wealth, and lethal patience. He had watched Victor Sterling tear through the underworld like a resurrected demon, punishing traitors and seizing lost territory with absolute ruthlessness. But Dominic knew every monster in the world had a soft underbelly waiting to be exposed. He paid the right hospital guards and tortured the right street informants until the impossible truth finally spilled out onto the pavement. The most feared man in New York was hopelessly obsessed with a broke cleaning woman and a fatherless toddler. Dominic smiled in the darkness of his private club, swirling an expensive glass of red wine while his deadly plan took perfect shape. He knew a bullet could easily miss a king, but a knife aimed directly at the heart never failed. He did not send a heavily armed hit squad to the fortified penthouse in Manhattan. He sent his silent, untraceable ghosts straight to the crumbling buildings of the Bronx to deliver a terrifying message. The protective perimeter Victor had secretly placed around the neighborhood of Clara was elite but inherently flawed. His heavily armed men watched the main streets and the alleyways, but they did not watch the rotting fire escapes hidden in the darkness. 3 of the finest infiltrators working for Dominic scaled the freezing brick wall of the apartment building like invisible spiders. They slipped through a rusted, broken window on the 5th floor without making a single sound. They stepped into the cramped studio apartment where the air smelled faintly of bleach and cheap baby soap. They did not break the fragile plates in the kitchen, and they did not slash the cheap mattress lying on the floor. Dominic had given them very specific orders to leave the humble home completely intact. True terror did not come from a violently destroyed room. It came from the absolute certainty that a predator could enter your private sanctuary and touch your most precious belongings while you were completely oblivious. One of the masked men approached the small pile of blankets in the corner of the room. He reached inside his heavy winter coat and pulled out a single item. He placed it perfectly in the center of the tiny pillow and left through the window like a fading shadow. Clara walked the 4 freezing blocks from the subway station just after midnight. Her shoulders ached violently from the heavy water bucket she had dragged across the hospital floors for 8 long hours. She held a sleeping Lily tightly against her chest, shielding the feverish toddler from the biting winter wind and the falling snow. Lily had spent the evening with a kind elderly neighbor down the hall, completely unaware of the dangerous shadows circling their fragile lives. Clara believed she had finally cut the invisible thread tying her to the violent world of Victor Sterling. She had looked a terrifying kingpin right in the eye and walked away, and the past 3 days of absolute silence had given her a false sense of security. She genuinely thought she had successfully protected her daughter from the bloody crossfire of billionaires and ruthless criminals. She unlocked the heavy deadbolt of her apartment door and pushed it open with her hip. The flickering hallway light cast a long, lonely shadow across the worn wooden floorboards. Clara stepped inside and kicked the door shut with the heel of her worn sneaker. She was completely ready to collapse into an exhausted sleep, but her raw survival instincts suddenly screamed in the dark. The air inside the cramped studio apartment was profoundly and terrifyingly wrong. Clara stood completely still in the narrow entryway and stopped breathing. Her small home usually smelled of stale building heat and the cheap lavender soap she bought from the corner grocery store. But tonight the air carried the sharp, unmistakable scent of expensive leather and heavy masculine cologne. It was the terrifying smell of dangerous men who absolutely did not belong in a poor Bronx apartment. Clara flipped the plastic light switch with a violently trembling hand. The pale bulb flickered 3 times before fully illuminating the tiny room. Nothing was broken, and nothing was missing from the small kitchen counter. Her worn winter boots were exactly where she had left them, and the single particle board table was completely untouched. But the unnatural scent was overpowering, choking the oxygen straight out of her lungs. She clutched Lily so tightly that the sleepy child let out a soft whine of protest. Clara slowly turned her head toward the far corner of the room where the small mattress lay on the bare floor. Sitting exactly in the center of the tiny pillow was a single, pristine black rose. The dark velvety petals absorbed the cheap fluorescent light like a miniature black hole. The thick stem was perfectly trimmed, completely free of sharp thorns, and laid with surgical precision right next to the one-eyed stuffed rabbit. There was no threatening note attached to the stem, and there was no ransom demand scrawled on the bathroom mirror. The message was deafeningly clear without a single written word. Dominic Russo was telling her that his lethal men knew exactly where her precious child slept. He was proving that the armed guards of Victor Sterling could not protect them from the darkness. He was promising that the next time his men entered this room, they would not leave a flower. Clara dropped her heavy canvas bag, and her knees completely buckled beneath her. She slid down the peeling wallpaper until she hit the cold floor, clutching her daughter in an absolute, suffocating panic. The criminal world she had desperately tried to escape had simply kicked the door in. She was completely out of options, and the scent of blood was already circling her innocent child. Clara stared at the perfect black rose resting on the tiny pillow of her daughter. The velvety petals seemed to swallow the dim light of the room and radiate a pure, suffocating terror. She knew exactly what to do when a normal man broke into an apartment, but Dominic Russo was not a normal man. If she called the police, they would file a useless report and leave her completely unprotected before the sun even rose. The criminal justice system belonged to the wealthy, and Clara did not have a single dollar to buy her safety. She looked down at Lily sleeping peacefully in her arms, completely oblivious to the invisible crosshairs painted on her small back. Clara had fought so desperately to keep her child out of the dark underworld of the East Coast Mafia. She had looked Victor Sterling right in the eye and demanded he forget their names to protect this fragile piece. But her fierce independence meant absolutely nothing against men who could pick locks like ghosts and leave threats on the beds of children. Clara swallowed her pride, her fear, and every single promise she had made to herself. She reached into her worn coat pocket with a violently shaking hand and pulled out the crisp white business card Silas had given her. She dialed the private number and pressed the cracked screen of her phone against her ear. The line rang exactly one time before the low, gravelly voice of Victor Sterling answered in the dead of night. Clara tried to speak, but her throat closed completely, and only a broken, terrified sob escaped her lips. Victor did not ask her to repeat herself, and he did not demand an explanation for the late-night call. He simply heard her crying and asked her exactly where she was. Clara forced the words out of her trembling mouth, telling him about the broken window and the black rose left right beside the stuffed rabbit. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and terrifying, heavy with a sudden, lethal promise. Victor told her to lock the door, turn off all the lights, and wait exactly 15 minutes. Then the line went dead, leaving Clara alone in the suffocating darkness of her Bronx apartment. She sat on the cold floor with her back pressed against the heavy door, holding Lily tightly to her chest while the minutes crawled by like hours. She listened to the howling winter wind outside, praying that the monster she had called would arrive before the monsters in the shadows returned. Exactly 15 minutes later, the screeching of heavy tires echoed loudly from the freezing street below. Heavy tactical boots thundered up the 5 flights of concrete stairs with absolute, terrifying military precision. Clara held her breath in the dark as someone knocked 3 times on her door in a fast, calculated rhythm. "It is Silas," a cold voice announced through the thin wood, and Clara scrambled to unlock the deadbolt with completely numb fingers. The heavy door swung open to reveal 6 massive men in dark tactical gear, carrying suppressed automatic weapons and sweeping the tiny apartment with blinding flashlights. Silas stepped inside and looked at the black rose on the pillow, his face completely devoid of emotion, but his eyes burning with a sudden, dark understanding. He did not waste time asking questions or comforting the terrified mother standing in the corner. He simply unbuttoned his heavy winter coat, draped it gently over the trembling shoulders of Clara, and told her it was time to leave. The armed men formed an impenetrable wall of Kevlar and steel around Clara and Lily as they moved swiftly down the narrow stairwell. They stepped out into the freezing New York night, where 3 armored black SUVs sat idling and waiting to swallow them whole. Clara sat in the back of the heavily armored vehicle, entirely surrounded by silent killers who watched the dark streets with lethal vigilance. The massive SUV sped away from the crumbling buildings of the Bronx and merged onto the highway, cutting through the winter storm like a bullet. She watched the glowing skyline of Manhattan grow larger through the bulletproof glass, realizing she was crossing a permanent, invisible line. She was leaving behind the exhausting, desperate life of a struggling single mother and entering the untouchable fortress of a billionaire kingpin. The convoy bypassed the regular city traffic and descended directly into the secure underground parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper on the Upper East Side. The heavy steel gates locked firmly shut behind them, sealing away the cold wind and the violent threats of the outside world. Silas escorted Clara and her sleeping daughter into a private, gleaming steel elevator that required a retinal scan to operate. The heavy doors closed silently, and the elevator shot upward at a dizzying speed, carrying them straight to the absolute top of the city. Clara held Lily tighter against her chest, her heart hammering wildly as the floor numbers climbed higher and higher into the sky. The elevator chimed softly, and the steel doors slid open to reveal the sprawling, immaculate penthouse of Victor Sterling. The massive living room featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering lights of Central Park, but Clara barely noticed the breathtaking view. Victor was standing completely still in the center of the room, waiting for them in the dead of the night. He was not wearing his pristine tailored suits or his terrifying Mafia persona, but simply a dark shirt and loose trousers that showed the heavy bandages still wrapping his chest. His hair was messy, and his cold gray eyes looked raw and exhausted, proving he had not slept a single minute since she walked away from him in the park. Clara stepped out of the elevator cautiously, her worn sneakers sinking deeply into the plush, expensive carpet. She was still shivering violently from the freezing cold and the absolute terror of the Black Rose, her green eyes wide and flooded with unshed tears. Lily was completely oblivious to the danger, sleeping peacefully with her head resting on the shoulder of her mother and her tiny hand gripping the collar of the borrowed coat. Victor looked at the exhausted cleaning woman and the fragile child she was desperately trying to protect from his violent world. He saw the violent tremors shaking her small frame, the stark terror written across her face, and the desperate way she clung to her daughter. In that exact moment, the iron control Victor had maintained for his entire 35 years shattered completely and irreparably. The impenetrable walls of ice he had built around his heart simply dissolved into nothing at the sight of her pure, helpless fear. He took 2 slow, careful steps forward, stopping just short of touching her because he knew she was too fragile to be crowded. He did not say he was sorry, and he did not offer useless apologies for the dangerous men who had hunted her. Instead, Victor turned his head slightly toward Silas, who was standing like a silent shadow by the elevator doors. "Find Dominic Russo," Victor commanded, his gravelly voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper that echoed through the quiet penthouse. "Find him tonight and end this forever." Clara looked up into the fierce, protective eyes of the most dangerous man on the East Coast, and for the first time in her entire life, she felt completely and absolutely safe. The order left the lips of Victor Sterling, and the entire East Coast underworld immediately caught fire. He did not call a meeting with the rival families, and he did not negotiate a peaceful surrender. A man who broke into the bedroom of a sleeping child did not deserve the respect of a sit-down. Victor unleashed his elite enforcers with a single, absolute command to leave nothing of the Russo syndicate standing. The retaliation was not a blind, raging mob war but a surgical, devastating strike executed with terrifying precision. Heavy black SUVs rolled through the freezing streets of New York, carrying heavily armed men who moved like shadows in the night. The illegal casinos owned by Dominic Russo were raided and burned to the ground before the fire department even received a call. Millions of dollars in laundered assets were seized, and the corrupt politicians who protected the Southern Territory suddenly stopped answering their phones. Warehouses filled with stolen goods were systematically emptied and completely destroyed by explosive charges. The violent message was broadcast clearly to every single criminal operating in the city. Victor proved exactly why the entire city had trembled at his name for the past 10 years. The financial destruction of the Russo Empire was only the beginning of the nightmare. Victor wanted to send a message so loud that no one would ever dare look in the direction of Clara and Lily again. In a single, violently orchestrated night, the 6 top lieutenants of Dominic Russo were systematically eliminated. They were pulled from their expensive restaurants, dragged from their luxury apartments, and intercepted on lonely highways. Silas led the extermination with his usual cold efficiency, leaving no witnesses and absolutely no room for retaliation. The bodies were not hidden, but left in highly visible locations to serve as a gruesome warning to the rest of the criminal underworld. The first lieutenant was found tied to the steering wheel of his own burning sports car. The second was left on the front steps of his illegal gambling hall with a bullet through his forehead. Panic spread through the remaining ranks of the Southern Syndicate like a deadly virus, and the loyal soldiers of Russo quickly abandoned their posts to save their own lives. They threw down their weapons and fled the city, knowing the wrath of Victor Sterling could not be stopped. By the time the sun began to rise over the freezing city, the massive criminal empire Dominic Russo had spent 20 years building was completely erased from the map. Dominic Russo realized he was fighting a war he had already lost, and he attempted to flee the city in a private helicopter. He packed millions of dollars in untraceable cash into heavy leather duffel bags and sped toward the industrial docks. But the pilots on his payroll had already been bought by the endless wealth of Victor Sterling. Dominic arrived at the private helipad on the edge of the freezing river, only to find the landing pad completely dark and empty. He turned around in the driving rain, his tailored coat soaked and his usual arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. Victor stepped out of the shadows of a massive shipping container, flanked by Silas and 4 men holding suppressed automatic weapons. The most feared Mafia boss in New York did not look like a man recovering from 3 bullet wounds. He walked toward Dominic with the slow, unstoppable momentum of an approaching executioner. The 2 rival kings stood face to face in the bitter cold, but only one of them commanded the absolute loyalty of the night. Dominic tried to negotiate, offering all of his hidden money and his remaining territory in a desperate bid to buy his miserable life. He swore he would never return to the city and promised to completely forget the cleaning woman and her child, but Victor simply shook his head. Victor did not care about the money, and he did not want the bloody Southern territory. He stepped close enough to look deeply into the terrified eyes of the man who had ordered a black rose placed on a tiny pillow. The memory of Clara trembling in absolute terror fueled a dark and consuming rage within his massive chest. He pulled a heavy silver pistol from his dark coat, his hand perfectly steady despite the freezing wind tearing across the open helipad. "You brought a threat into the room where an innocent child sleeps," Victor stated, his gravelly voice cutting through the noise of the storm like a serrated blade. "And now you are going to pay for that mistake with your final breath." He did not drag out the moment with long speeches or cruel torture because he wanted to return to his penthouse as quickly as possible. Victor raised the weapon and delivered a single, fatal message that echoed sharply across the empty industrial yard. Dominic Russo fell heavily onto the wet concrete, his empty eyes staring blindly at the falling snow. The greatest threat to the new family of Victor was permanently extinguished without a single ounce of mercy. Victor turned his back on the fallen rival and walked away into the dark, leaving the bloody crown of the underworld behind him so he could finally go home. The sprawling Manhattan penthouse was a fortress built of cold glass and impenetrable steel. It was designed to keep enemies out, but it had never been meant to hold a family inside. Clara spent her first few days jumping at every shadow and flinching whenever the private elevator chimed in the hall. But the heavy, suffocating silence of the massive apartment was quickly broken by the tiny, echoing footsteps of Lily. The toddler did not understand that she was living in the heavily guarded stronghold of the most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast. She treated the priceless Persian rugs like a playground and completely ignored the heavily armed men standing by the heavy doors. Victor Sterling had just annihilated an entire criminal syndicate in a single night, but he found himself completely defenseless against a 2-year-old girl. He did not know how to interact with children, and his massive hands were only used to holding weapons and signing death warrants. Yet he found himself quietly canceling midnight meetings just to sit in the corner of the living room and watch her play. He found himself hiding his guns in biometric safes and ordering his lethal men to speak in hushed whispers. The violent storm that had defined his entire existence was suddenly blocked by the bright, chaotic energy of a toddler, and the ruthless king of the underworld was slowly being conquered without a single shot being fired. The violent insomnia that had plagued Victor for years suddenly took on a completely different shape. He used to spend his sleepless nights plotting the destruction of his enemies and counting his laundered millions in the dark. But on a freezing Tuesday at 2 a.m, Clara walked into the massive marble kitchen and found a completely surreal scene. Victor was standing in the soft glow of the refrigerator light, wearing a dark shirt and attempting to boil a pot of milk. His brow was furrowed in deep concentration, and he looked far more stressed than he had during the bloodiest mob wars of his life. Lily had woken up crying with a mild fever, and the deadliest man in New York was frantically searching how to warm a baby bottle. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him measure the milk with the exact, deadly precision of a bomb technician. He did not ask his private chefs or his armed guards for help because he stubbornly wanted to protect his new family all by himself. Clara finally stepped forward and gently guided his scarred hands, showing him how to test the temperature against his broad wrist. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the quiet kitchen, and the dangerous electricity between them hummed louder than the expensive appliances. He handed the warm bottle to Clara, and his rough fingers accidentally brushed against her soft skin. A sudden jolt of pure heat shot up her arm, completely erasing the cold memories of her abusive past, but the baby cried out from the other room and broke the heavy spell. The awkward domestic routine slowly evolved into quiet, unspoken rituals that fundamentally changed the cold atmosphere of the penthouse. Victor started walking into the guest bedroom every evening just as Clara was tucking Lily under the thick down blankets. He initially stood in the doorway like a silent, terrifying shadow, but Lily quickly demanded that he sit on the edge of the mattress. She shoved a brightly colored picture book into his massive, scarred hands and waited expectantly for him to speak. Victor had spent his entire adult life issuing terrifying threats and barking brutal commands in smoke-filled basements. His gravelly voice was stiff and entirely unsuited for rhyming tales about talking animals, but he read every single page with absolute, deadly serious dedication. He would read the exact same ridiculous story 3 times in a row just to keep a smile on her small face. The men who feared him in the streets would have never believed that the ruthless king of New York was currently playing the role of a sleepy bear. Lily did not care that his tone was flat or that his pronunciation was rough, because she simply felt entirely safe in his massive presence. She would drift to sleep with her tiny fingers securely wrapped around his heavy thumb, refusing to let him leave the room. Clara would watch them from the doorway, her heart aching beautifully as the terrifying Mafia boss completely surrendered to the innocent demands of a toddler. The absolute breaking point for the frozen heart of Victor arrived on a perfectly clear night just before the end of the month. Clara was washing dishes in the kitchen while Victor sat on the massive outdoor terrace, staring out at the glowing Manhattan skyline. Lily wandered out through the sliding glass door, dragging her one-eyed stuffed rabbit across the cold stone floor. She climbed fearlessly right into the lap of the ruthless kingpin, completely ignoring the dangerous tension he usually carried in his broad shoulders. The toddler pointed a tiny, chubby finger up at the bright crescent moon hanging over the dark and busy city. She looked right into his cold gray eyes and softly whispered his first name, a simple, perfect sound that shattered his defenses completely. Victor had not heard his own name spoken with pure, unconditional affection since he was a broken, terrified orphan on the streets of Brooklyn. He looked down at the child who had anchored him in his coma, and the impenetrable ice around his heart violently cracked open. A single, heavy tear escaped his eye and rolled slowly down his scarred cheek, the very first tear he had shed in over 20 years. He did not wipe it away, and he did not try to hide his face in the shadows of the terrace. He simply pulled the little girl tighter against his chest and buried his face in her soft hair, finally realizing this fragile family was the only thing he truly wanted to protect. Clara stepped out onto the terrace just in time to witness the most dangerous man in the city quietly weeping in the dark. She did not say a word, and she did not wipe the tear away, because she knew he needed to feel the absolute weight of his own salvation. She waited until Lily fell fast asleep against his chest before she slowly crossed the cold stone floor and sat directly beside him. Clara looked at the man who had destroyed an entire criminal syndicate just to keep her safe, and all of her lingering fears finally vanished into the night wind. She reached out and gently placed her soft hand over his massive, scarred knuckles, anchoring him firmly to the present moment. Victor turned his head and looked at her with the profound, completely unguarded vulnerability that stole the breath right out of her lungs. The unspoken tension that had been building between them for weeks finally crystallized into a blinding, undeniable truth that neither of them could ignore. Clara leaned in and pressed her lips against his in a passionate, desperate embrace that tasted like forgiveness and absolute trust. He wrapped his free arm around her waist and pulled her flush against his side, silently promising to protect this fragile piece with his dying breath. They held each other tightly under the watchful eye of the crescent moon, two deeply broken souls who had finally found their way home in the dark. 6 months passed since the violent night the Southern Syndicate burned to the ground. Victor Sterling did something the East Coast underworld considered absolutely impossible. He began to systematically dismantle the very empire he had built with blood and bullets. He sold off the illegal gambling rings and shut down the shadowy extortion operations that had fed his massive wealth for 10 years. The transition was incredibly dangerous and cost him millions of dollars in untraceable cash. His remaining lieutenants whispered that the ruthless king had finally lost his mind to a cleaning woman. But Victor did not care about the opinions of violent men anymore. He took his massive fortune and funneled it directly into legitimate real estate and high-end technology investments. He bought up crumbling apartment buildings in the Bronx and completely renovated them into safe, affordable housing. He was no longer interested in ruling a city through fear and intimidation. He was entirely focused on building a permanent, impenetrable fortress of safety for the only two people who mattered to his healing heart. The crown jewel of his new legitimate empire was a charitable organization named the Luna Foundation. He did not build it as a tax shelter or a hollow public relations stunt to appease the federal government. He built it specifically for the exhausted single mother who had once saved his life in the dark. Victor placed Clara Hayes exactly where she belonged, naming her the executive director with absolute control over the massive endowment. Clara traded her faded janitor uniform for tailored suits, but she never forgot the crushing weight of the invisible world she left behind. She spent her days opening free child care centers for night shift workers and paying off the medical debts of desperate families. She created an emergency escape network for women trapped in abusive homes, ensuring no mother ever had to face the terrors she had barely survived. She worked with the fierce, relentless dedication of a survivor who finally had the power to pull others out of the abyss. Victor watched her transform from a terrified victim into a magnificent force of nature, his dark heart swelling with an unfamiliar, profound pride. The bitter winter finally melted into a warm, gentle spring across the towering skyline of Manhattan. Clara stood on the massive stone terrace of the penthouse, looking out over the glittering city that could no longer hurt her. Lily was playing happily inside the sprawling living room, her tiny fingers clutching the one-eyed stuffed rabbit as she chased Silas around the expensive furniture. Victor stepped out onto the balcony and wrapped his strong arms around the waist of Clara, pulling her back against his broad chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the scent of lavender soap that always managed to calm the violent storms in his mind. They stood together in perfect, absolute silence, two deeply broken souls who had forged an unbreakable family not by blood, but by a desperate, miraculous choice. The city below them still held millions of invisible people fighting to survive the night, but Clara and Victor were finally free from the darkness. He turned her around and kissed her deeply under the watchful light of the crescent moon, sealing their impossible redemption with a promise that would last for the rest of their lives. This beautiful story reminds us that unconditional love has the power to resurrect even the darkest and most broken hearts. It proves that our past mistakes and deep scars do not have to dictate the final chapters of our lives. True strength is never found in violence or absolute power, but in the courage to change and the willingness to protect the fragile people we cherish. A family is not simply defined by the blood running through your veins, but by the people who choose to stand beside you when the rest of the world walks away. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this emotional journey here at Sunni Romance. How did this incredible story make you feel today? Have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that completely changed the trajectory of your entire life? Please share your beautiful thoughts in the comments below, because we truly love reading the stories you carry in your hearts. We wish you and your loved ones perfect health, endless joy, and days filled with absolute peace.